Hello, and thank you very much for the warm welcome and great speech, Mark. Congratulations, wonderful speech. Thank you very much. Okay, let's see. Yeah. Now, I think in the run-up to this meeting, there was the organizers pointed out that the Living Planet, the new, most recent Living Planet Index, the Living Planet report was issued just basically days ago, last week. And it talks about new data available that document the mass extinction that is underway worldwide. So we are talking about having lost more than 50% of the vertebrates in the last 40 years. And then I'm working with people in the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, and what strikes me is that the new data also, I mean from observation, not from modeling, show us that half of the overall greenhouse gas, man-made so-called greenhouse gas emissions since the early industrial times in the 1750s, half of those emissions were produced in the last 40 years. And I said, wow, that's interesting. Half of the species extinct in 40 years, the last 40 years, and half of the total greenhouse gas emissions on the planet also produced in the last 40 years. So these last 40 years must have been the most horrible time for the planet and its ecosystems and living beings ever, from a sustainability point of view. And why is that so? And I remember that wasn't 1970 the year when the Club of Rome published the famous report, first report, Limits to Growth. And I was meeting with Ernst von Weizsäcker just a few weeks ago in Germany, and he was talking about their plans for the next report. And really, those were the heroes at the time and the early predictors of what would happen in those 40 years. So in those last 40 years, we've seen a massive change, global change going on the planet and to the planet and all of its living systems. And we call it the Anthropocene, after Nobel laureate Paul Crutzen, who basically introduced this term. We no longer live in the Holocene, we live in the Anthropocene. This is just, I like these pictures by Noah. Of course, they are not single pictures, they are produced out of many, many satellite images. But it shows what the, symbolically, what the Anthropocene means. It means total domination of the planet by humans for the very first time in the Earth, the planet's history. And it also shows the disparities. So there's a huge issue of indifferential impacts, a huge issue of lack of fairness and a large amount of global injustice, and I'll come back to that. So the Anthropocene is both about dominating the Earth's great cycles in an unprecedented way, and in a way that disrupts those. And we really are at risk of destruction of some of those geophysical grand cycles of the planet, and of course of its species. And also the Anthropocene stands for, that's how I see it at least, a great amount of social injustice and disparity, growing disparities worldwide. This country, in Europe, where I'm from, and of course in the so-called developing world. And those pieces belong together. Usually I speak with people who identify themselves as environmentalists or social development. We are working towards bringing those camps together scientifically, but also in terms of action. And as Mark said before, activism for animals is a deeply humane activity that also is about ourselves. It is about educating ourselves. It is about our own dignity and spiritual obligations and fulfillments. So the Anthropocene, and again, this is, I mean, geologists call it now, the Anthropocene. It's not just a nice term. I mean, they argue that this is a new era for the planet, actually, in the evolution of the planet. So the Anthropocene creates a lot of impacts, and all of them have dramatically increased over those famous or infamous last 40 years. Of course, everybody knows about rising greenhouse gas emissions, anthropogenic climate change, and the growing ozone hole in the south. So we're not talking about the one in the north. That's much better. Louder? And please forgive my German accent. I just spent 3 months back home, so I have to be re-Americanized again. Freshwater stress. I'll come back to this because this is also going to be a huge issue here in the United States. Ocean acidification, big problem for biodiversity, ocean biodiversity. In fact, the #1 impact of climate change on biodiversity. The problem with the nitrogen cycle by use of heavy use of fertilizers to feed now a world population of more than 7 billion. And we're talking about 9 billion people by the year 2050. And to do that, we are completely disrupting the global natural nitrogen cycle with also severe impact. Some people are forgetting about these things because they only focus on more obvious climate change, etc. Loss of multiple ecosystem services, goods and services, the services that ecosystems produce, on which we depend heavily in various ways. Habitat destruction, loss of livelihoods, dramatic loss of biodiversity, food supply for animals and humans, of course. Overfishing, overhunting, overgathering, overexploitation of natural resources leading to population collapses and mass species extinction. And then, of course, and that is very interesting also in the One Health context, new and emerging diseases and more frequent outbreaks of a very non-linear, hard to predict way. Look at Ebola right now. It is also a zoonotic disease. Ultimately originating from problems with human-animal interaction in a underdevelopment, unfairness context. So that's a real One Health issue too. And global pandemics coming out of that. I will provide more information on that too. So, I would like to talk a little bit about climate change and biodiversity, because clearly when we talk, and again, I mean the fact that 40 years of dramatically shrinking biodiversity and 40 years of dramatically increasing greenhouse gas emissions, hey, that's not a coincidence, okay? So there is a very, very close connection between global climate change and global loss of biodiversity, and in fact, global climate change, as we see it today and experience it, is the #1 cause for loss of biodiversity. Many people think, no, it's the direct interaction of humans, killing too many animals or hunting too much. No, no, no. It's really driven by man-made climate change as the #1 cause. And then we'll see how this fits together and how a One Health perspective may help. I'm also, like Mark, an optimist. I think that's why we are university professors. As Sarah said, I spent 15 years with the UN, and when I started to work with the UN, I was a great optimist. And by the way, I was not only a scientific advisor, they promoted me up to director and diplomat, etc. I became, at some point, I got my own version of PTSD in a way. And I got a little bit frustrated. I hope there's no UN colleague here in the room. And there are some on campus that also quit the UN after some time. I got a little bit frustrated. The UN is a fine organization, and I met wonderful people there, wonderful, extremely bright people. It is the most multicultural workplace on earth, and I really enjoyed all that. It's not about the UN. It's about all these silly politicians and so-called government leaders, whether elected or not elected, doesn't matter, doesn't make a big difference in that context. Just, you know, destroying all progress that the organization would love to pursue. I mean, there are great people in the UN, there are great ideas, and then, you know, the states don't let us. There's wonderful ideas to reduce carbon emissions and, you know, work against climate change. The UN has done so much in the past 20 years to stop climate change from happening. And every year and every year and every year, you see all these politicians in their limousines coming into New York or wherever the meeting takes place with their bodyguards and just blah, 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 blah. At the end of the day, nothing happens because governments don't allow the UN to do so. So just to make that clear, it's not about the UN. I love the UN. But I thought, no, I go back to university. It's time now. And there I can be an optimist and really do something together with all these wonderful people that you meet in the university context. So that was just a side remark. And I think, Mark, I understand what you're saying. So I'm an optimist. And I really would like to look at this not so much from the doomsday scenario side. As with my classes and my students, I have to take them through the doomsday scenarios because that's what we are talking about. But then really look at possible solutions, hopefully. Okay, most recent data. This is published November 2013, the most recent outlook on global warming. When we talk about global warming, then of course it's the annual mean surface temperature. Okay? So here we are talking about an annual projection and looking back an annual, observation on an annual mean temperature level at the surface. And many people say, for instance, now when I was back in Germany, I was invited to give a talk about climate change and human dimensions at a big international conference, and it happened to be cold in Germany and raining for 2 months basically, and people said, leave me alone with that global warming stuff. It's not true. Of course it's true. I mean that is all measurement. We are no longer talking about theories, projections. This is all observed. Hard science. Nothing is as well assessed as climate change now. It's by a world community of thousands of top scientists. So we can be very, very sure. Okay, that said, what we see here is an amazing trajectory of, again, increase of global average mean temperature on the surface. And that is producing, and there are certain hotspots, literally, and heat islands. And that is especially scary. And there are also some paradox cool spaces. And that interplay, I'm going to say a little bit about that, produces an enormous stress on already very much biodiversity under stress. So here, all this is new data. Here we see the observed global average combined land and ocean surface temperature from 1850 through 2012. This is when the recent data stopped, 2012, peer review time, and we never have the actual global data in real time. So there is a delay of 1 to 2 years usually. But that is the most recent you can get. And what you see here is, again, in the last 40 years, if you look at that curve, sort of an exponential increase. So there are still some skeptics, especially here in the United States. I never meet any skeptics elsewhere, but here you still read them. It's a surviving species somehow. I read an interesting paper by the World Bank recently. Guess in which country have the most climate deniers on the planet? It's not North Korea. It's the United States. So climate variability is one thing. You always have these fluctuations, and they have a lot to do with sun radiation cycles and stuff. That's normal. But then you see this exponential increase. And that is precisely happening. It's starting here. It's like the Apple stock after they dipped earlier this year. I mean, this is not normal. It's called the global temperature anomaly, and this pretty much reflects what's going on in terms of man-made climate change in those 40 years. And you can also nicely see it in the graph down in decadal averages. That all of a sudden, starting in the year 1970, it jumps up. This is the combined greenhouse gas emission levels. And you all know that CO2 is number one. I mean, there are other greenhouse gases that are more dangerous, like methane. But CO2 is number one just in terms of output, because that's due to the industrial metabolism. And the other important gases are there too. And with all of these gases, you see a similar curve moving up since 1970. So in those 40 years. So the two curves here are total CO2 and observed CO2. Especially with the total CO2 in the atmosphere, you also see the exponential curve starting here. And at the same time, and that is really making it even worse, much worse, the CO2 sinks are coming down. So you have that the adaptive capacity of the planet and its ecosystems to absorb, because there is this natural capacities in forests, in the ocean, etc., in the soils, is coming down too. So you have a double effect here, which drives this process further. And that, here we are already speaking about biodiversity, because the community is now looking at ecosystem-based adaptation as the most promising. That's interesting. First of all, it started to be the most promising adaptation strategy, adapting to climate change, but now it's even seen as a mitigation strategy to avoid further peaks in global warming and carbon in the atmosphere. That is interesting. But what is happening is that the more we lose the ecosystem services and biodiversity, and that is also reflected in that curve, because biodiversity has a very important role to play in providing carbon sinks. So that is going down, and then you see this scissor going out more and more. That is a very worrying picture that we see here. Total atmospheric CO2, we have well reached already a level of 400 parts per million, which I recall the first climate summit, climate change summit that was held in Geneva at the time by UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. And it was said, yeah, we shouldn't go beyond 350 parts per million. And it is just, it's less than 20 years ago. Because that will be really dangerous. Now we are way beyond 400 already. And people say, yeah, as a matter of fact, we will reach 550 by 2030. So where does that stop? And so now there is a whole community, Dale Rothman of Wild School and I are just talking about that. There's a new research community talking about planetary boundaries. What are the boundaries, actually, that we should respect to keep the planet stable and healthy, and all of its living beings as well? Now, we are already above and beyond such critical thresholds, and we can also see one of those is very important for biodiversity. In fact, the number one source of biodiversity loss on the planet is happening in the oceans. I mean, people are always fascinated by the oceans, what's going on in the oceans, and we love all these BBC TV shows about life in the water, in the ocean, etc. But we know very little about the ocean, and especially in terms of biology, marine biology. It is the most unknown space still on the planet, and yet this is the single most tragedy that's happening in terms of biodiversity. So there are two things: there is global warming, and there is a rapid, dramatic acidification process going on in the oceans. So this is just for reference. If you're interested, look at the ipcc.org website, the UN main site. These are projections to the next 500 years. And as some of you may know, the IPCC always works with scenarios. There is always a best case scenario and the worst case scenarios. And then there are between 3 and 5 scenarios in between. And, you know, with common sense, as rational thinkers, we assume, well, you know, let's look at the mean middle ground scenarios. This is probably most realistic. So far, reality has always been worse than even the worst case scenarios. This is the 5th assessment. And for all of the 4 earlier assessment reports, the actual reality was always worse than even the worst case scenario. So, that being said, we don't know yet. But what you can see is that even the best case scenario is still projecting rising emissions. This is the best case scenario, and this is the median of basically of the scenarios. And this is the best case scenario. This is the median. This is the best case scenario, and you can see from 2000 onwards there is still a significant corridor of increasing carbon emissions, because even under best case circumstances, countries like China and probably countries like the United States and a number of European countries, although we are doing a little better, you know, South Africa, India, Brazil alone will continue to produce carbon emissions quite significantly, and even if it's best case, it's still quite bad. Now, the median is like this, and this is the worst case scenario there, the median of the worst case scenario for the year 2100. And there we are looking at 4.5 temperature rise. That is dramatic. If you've seen the movie The Day After Tomorrow by Roland Emmerich a few years ago, it's no longer probably just a Hollywood blockbuster, because that is fairly dramatic. And this is basically the same for sea level rise. Again, median of the worst case scenario, best case scenario, median of the worst case scenario. And again, so far, the reality was always more on that side and even above that. Now here we are looking towards the end of the century in that scenarios, and here we are talking about a global mean sea level rise of up to 1 meter. Doesn't sound dramatic, 1 meter less or more, but boy, I mean, for what's going on the planet, and not only for humans that have to be resettled dramatically, this is going to produce dramatic disruptions. Of course, also it means the end of many species in the oceans, because sea level rises also has to do with a very different composition in the waters, salt in the water, etc., etc. And I will skip that. If you're interested, I'm happy to share this with you. There are a few other things just to demonstrate. Oh yeah, this is interesting, because this is looking back to the last IPCC scenarios. These were the scenarios then. The 5 scenarios the IPCC worked with, and again, the red one is the worst case scenario. And I remember it very well. The last IPCC assessment report was, number 4, was presented to the public in January 2007 in Paris. Actually, then French President Jacques Chirac hosted that meeting. I was there, Jane Goodall was there. We were both speakers there, and a few other people. It was wonderful because Jacques Chirac was an interesting, or is an interesting politician, but he is an environmentalist, and it was really great. And I remember those scenarios were presented, and there was a huge campaign in the media, even in some liberal newspapers, that, oh, this is too much now, they are going crazy, the UN is now totally, socialist, and they want to take over and stop of being productive. They're talking about zero growth economy, and it was a scandal, actually. Among other factors, this curve was seen as absolutely scandalous. The worst case scenario for fuel emissions based on 2005 levels. Okay, so what happened then is that the measured emissions were even worse than what we said at the time. And I'm sure the same thing will happen again. So here, to cut it short enough, we're talking about tremendous apocalyptic scenarios for the future this century, our century. This is where it will all happen. Okay, and so all of these trajectories that I've shown you and many more are producing severe impacts for the planet, its ecosystems, and all the species that live on the planet. So you can see they are classified in physical systems, biological systems, and in human and so-called managed systems, agriculture, etc. Physical systems is blue, for instance, glaciers, snow, ice, the so-called cryptosphere. This is, I mean, you all know that probably by now. This is dramatic. We see the Greenland ice shelf shrinking by 2040, 2050 at the latest. It will be green in the summer. Just guess what this means for the polar bear. I spent 3 weeks on a research trip in the Alps. This summer I went to 5 different glaciers, and I have wonderful footage and material, but time is a little short, so when I was seeing the animals with Marg, I was a little bit envious. And I showed Dale some of my pictures here. I have nice pictures here also with mountain animals and shrinking glaciers. Maybe next time, or I'll send it to you if you're interested. So I went to some of those glacial areas, and some of the glaciers in Europe that were existing for billions of years, and some of them for millions of years. That's the younger one. They are now at the size of 2%, between 2% and 10% of their actual size. And so this is happening. These are just a few examples with the cryptosphere. And of course, it all has impact on biodiversity. But if you look at the actual biological systems, the terrestrial ecosystems, for instance, and the marine ecosystems that are hit worst, and then things like wildfire has become such an issue here in the southwestern United States, but also in parts of Europe and Latin America. Parts of Asia as well. You see that a lot is going on. I don't have the time to get to all of these, but I'm happy to share the whole report with you, with all the data and all the stories behind it. So, for instance, in the Arctic is one of the most biologically, ecosystem-wise, most exposed and sensitive zone with little adaptive capacity. Things in the permafrost, there is little adaptive capacity, and that's just the coefficient of that kind of ecosystem landscape. So the Arctic will be hit most. The Antarctic is a little less biodiverse, but also there, in combination with the ozone hole and the melting away of the West Antarctic ice sheet, there's also huge impacts. And then on many in many areas, especially in North America, if we look at North America, we have basically massive snowmelt in the Rockies. We will see increasing wildfires from year to year. And if there is a year like this, where there is more precipitation, it doesn't change the trend. And people starting already, telling me here in Denver, because it's dry, we have no wildfires. Yeah, but just wait for the next 10 years and see how things go. There is tremendous water stress to be expected. These are just 3 examples. And then in some areas, food production will be a big issue, for instance in Africa, but also in Latin America. And I have worked in the UN context that deals with land degradation, hunger, poverty, and conflict and migration. So there's an office of the UN to deal with that stuff. Most of the conflicts that we've been seeing recently, for instance in Africa or in the Middle East, have to do with climate change-induced loss of biodiversity leading to shrinking livestock, food production and food supply, triggering the poverty cycle further, and that leads to fragile states, governments, failing governance systems. It leads to migration and internal displacement. It leads to riot and social unrest. Sudan, and especially South Sudan, is the first case that was officially acknowledged to be a war due to climate change, acknowledged by the UN Security Council. And the UN Security Council is in charge of war and peace. And that was the first one ever when they, and President Obama chaired that session, when they said, yeah, this whole war we are seeing there and the migration is due to climate change, no doubt about it. And we will see more. Iraq is the same thing now. I have been working in Iraq with the ambassador of Iraq to the UN over the last 3 years in a project advising the government of Iraq on environmental sustainability, and I would never say it's hopeless, but it's pretty difficult there. What we are seeing now, the infiltration of IS forces in the north ultimately has to do with no fresh water available, heavily contaminated soil. The fact that they are able, they are not invading the country from the moon. They are recruiting massively within the population, the younger population. People are without any hope. They're just desperate. So, it's just a tragedy. The lands are drying out there, and biodiversity is no more. See nothing. These are, and it's not even desert ecosystems. It's savanna ecosystems and even forest ecosystems. Everything has been cut down. Everything has been destroyed, contaminated after the war. The Brits used extremely toxic ammunition during that strange war 10 years ago, and so no farming is possible. People just die years after they eat that food. We had a German professor, a colleague, who went there for a project and died because of intoxication there. And so this is what happens when biodiversity is lost in an already fragile human social ecological context. And unfortunately, I'm afraid we will see more. Global water stress is an issue that sometimes is forgotten. As we talk a lot about climate change, we tend to forget things like, hey, what's going on with the freshwater on the planet? There's just 7.5% of the entire water on the planet is available as freshwater. And we have now more than 7 million people. Hello. What is going to happen there? And I tell you, the southwestern United States will be hit by a long freshwater crisis. Already we see those signs in Southern California, partly also in Colorado, in other places. And the ecosystems are very different. In Arizona, that's normal. It's crazy to live in Phoenix. They have the world-leading Institute of Global Sustainability there. You know, I visit them because scientifically it's excellent what they are doing, and I like Mike Crow, who's the president of ASU, and it's great work, but it's a little crazy to do this in the most unsustainable place in the United States. But there it's normal. I mean, it's just the ecosystem is like that. Okay, but then if you go to California, these are different ecosystems. If you go to New Mexico, northern New Mexico, these are very living ecosystems with lots of species. But what we will see there in those areas is drought after drought after drought, and wildfire does the rest. And so we will probably see a decline of biodiversity in ecosystem services in the next 40 years by up to 80%. So as you can see, if you compare that, just looking at the color codes, southwestern United States will be as bad as the Middle East, I mean, in terms of drought and water unavailability. And I don't have to tell you what that means for biodiversity and health. Tipping point theory, I want to cut this also a little bit short, just as a little image. Some of you may have heard about the tipping element theory or the tipping point theory. There's friends and colleagues of Dale and me that are behind that. It's now called the planetary boundary movement. Most people from Europe, they're also from the United States. And about 10 years ago, they came up with a wonderful article, first published in PNAS and then in Science, Nature, the next one. They said, hey, we have so many data available that hint to an enormous, totally never seen before global risk of real doomsday scenarios. There are large-scale ecosystems and climatic systems on the planet that are so much under stress. Some of them risk to go well beyond critical thresholds, and then their functioning is very much at risk. And if a critical mass of those single large-scale systems fail, then the entire planet system will be at risk. We have no idea what that means, but we have seen those movies, you know, apocalyptic movies. Prophets told about it in many religions thousands of years ago. I don't know. I don't want to get pathetic now, but this is science. Now, what the science says is that there are very fragile, large-scale planetary systems like the permafrost area in Siberia, like the Greenland ice shelf, like the Amazonian rainforest, like the Saharan vegetation, and so on. We know that within these famous last 40 years, or infamous last 40 years, a lot has been happening, especially in those areas. For instance, global warming inevitably will lead to a melting away of the permafrost ice cover in Siberia. And Siberia, I don't know, it has certainly the size of the United States alone. There are massive, the world's, I mean, most stocks of methane are stocked there. They've been there eternally in the permafrost, nicely covered, locked in. With that melting of the ice, these stocks will be released. They will be flowing into the atmosphere. And methane is 7 times more, a little bit more than 7 times more harmful to the atmosphere than CO2 even is. So that alone will contribute to further global warming in a totally unpredictable way. It's just one example. Amazonian rainforest, this is not only, this is a social ecological issue, because it's also people there, indigenous cultures, etc. It's about oppressive rule of the central government, thousands of kilometers down in the south on very wonderful indigenous cultures, but it is also about the largest reservoir of genetic resources and biodiversity on the planet, not only with region, because this is so big that it's not local anyway. But not only with regional significance, it has global significance in many ways, also direct implications for human health. Now, what's happening there is also triggered by McDonald's, it's triggered by the global timber market, and all of these things. It is a capitalistic, total exploitation of the most precious biodiversity resources and forestry resources on the planet, with, again, global significance. And this is just the second example, and there are more. The ice sheet melting in Greenland, that's the third one, and the stuff there is not only bad for the polar bears, they are as iconic as pandas are, so they are at risk of total extinction, because they have no adaptive capacity. I mean, you can send them to European zoos, but that's not the solution. What happens there is that this massive amount of frozen freshwater going into the ocean will dramatically change the molecular composition there. It will lead to further acidification. It will lead to a disruption of the Gulf Stream, which has a paradox effect on North America, especially Canada, where it will become cooler. And that again will impact on the livelihoods there, so there are chain reactions going on. And all of those have the potential of those massive chain reductions into the other systems. And so our friends here said in this article, critical mass, certain combination, 4 or 5 or 7 of them tipping, failing, then God knows what will happen to the entire planet. Because the planet's survival and functioning in a way depends on the function of those systems. So this is a little bit projection, fiction, writing thing for many people, and they say, slow down, relax, take a pill, drink a beer, watch a baseball game. But the UN, as I said, can be quite smart. And what they did is they were bypassing, and we were, because I was part of it, bypassing the governments and said, let's measure, actually. Let's use our own funding. We don't ask for it. We don't ask governments to approve it. Measuring the behavior over the last 15 years of some of those tipping point areas. So the tipping point areas were nicely identified by those planetary boundary people, scientists. And then we in the UN said, let's go there and take some actual data measuring the impact of the last 15 years. You're not supposed to be able to read this, don't worry. And again, it will be in the presentation, which we hope will be online. Here you see the Western Hemisphere, and this is the Eastern Hemisphere. Just in a one-sentence summary, there is a remarkable, oops, that's a different one. There is a remarkable correlation or correspondence between what the tipping point theory says and what we can already measure in terms of extreme weather events, be it chaotic and prolonged hurricane seasons, producing much more damage than ever before, be it an enormous exponential increase in the amount, frequency, and intensity of wildfires, many other factors, but even the tectonic activity of the planet. And that is still a little bit fiction style, because nobody can really say, well, does this have to do with climate change? I mean, if you look around the fire belt from the Philippines up to Hawaii, there is a 20-fold, or sometimes even 30-fold, 30 times higher tectonic activity. And the Munich reinsurance company, they have their own research think tank, and they measure this stuff. And what we see out of observation is that we also see an exponential growth in the last 30 years of natural disasters. So there's a lot going on the planet right now. And what we saw here is that those hotspots on the planet where the most of that stuff is happening is actually, if you would overlay, I should do this for the next presentation. Those slides, you will see that a lot of that is happening exactly in the zones where it was predicted. Just to sum this up. Now, melting ice, especially in the northern hemisphere, bad news for the polar bears, but also with other triggered chain reactions for the entire sea life. You know what that means. I mean, I spoke about ocean acidification. Acid oceans mean dying coral reefs. So there is a direct implication there. This is a previously nice coral reef just out of Scheffel, the border between Israel and Jordan and Egypt. I was diving there 15 years ago, and now it looks like this. It's already destroyed. And then the wildfires. So these are three impacts that can, in terms of biodiversity, immediately felt also here in North America. Three of the most significant impacts of climate change on biodiversity. These three, and then of course also huge disruption of the productivity of agricultural activities. And if agriculture is done the right way, then it also gives rise to a lot of biodiversity, and it is also creating more resilience. I'm sorry, Mark, I'm using the R word. I will use it again. Farming can and has to contribute to biodiversity and resilience if you do it right. But climate change is heavily affecting that. So then genetic modification is supposed to be the answer, but of course it's not. It's contrary. So the answers we seem to have right now are pretty bad, actually. We have to think of new ideas. So some species can adapt faster than others, and this is a projection into the likelihood of further species loss due to climate change. Rodents, primates, we're not talking about plants here because we're more focusing on animals today. Actually, the species that has the least adaptive capacity to climate change is trees. Okay, but that's not an animal, unfortunately, for today. And they need the trees. Good point. Good point. Very good point. So, of course, how could I not think? So the split-hoofed mammals are in a relatively good position, and so are the carnivore mammals. Insects, speaking to E.O. Wilson's quote, so no worries about the insects. I don't know what freshwater mollusks are. Okay, but look at those. This is our. It's not a species. How do you call it? Family group. Okay. In German, we call it Gattung. And the rodents. It's an interesting neighborhood. I mean, we have rabbits in the house. Or right now they are with Erica, but rabbits are our most famous animals, pets of my kids, and so that means that those two actually will have families of species will have the biggest problem with climate change. There's a lot of data that goes into that modeling. So this is the abbreviated policymaker slide. You can also see it here. The possibility to move, because that's the point here. Adaptive capacity is one factor for adaptive capacity is the ability to leave livelihoods. We see this. I'm working with my research assistant Abbey on a new publication on environment. Sorry. We are working on an article that's looking at climate change-induced human migration. And there's a lot of that going on. And it's a tragedy. It is a tragedy, but it's the only way people can survive and still make a living, hopefully. And of course, it has a lot of problems. It leads then to urbanization and new social issues, etc. It also produces more environmental problems, but that's the way to survive. And for animals, it really depends on the species. So, in many circumstances, leaving those ecosystems and migrating to other ecosystems and even continents would be the solution. But a number of animals can't. They don't have that capacity naturally. And, then the brilliant government official may have the idea, oh, let's get them all on Noah's Ark and ship them there. And that also doesn't really help in many cases. They might just die because they're adapted to these new climatic systems, etc. So what we see here is indeed no worries about insects and butterflies, and also the split-toothed mammals, so elks will be fine, moose will be fine, the mountain lions will probably be okay, but our own species and our own family of species carries the most risk. And this, by the way, was not looking at sea life. This is just terrestrial ecosystems. Now, there is a close intersection, and there are a lot of feedback loops between all what's happening on the planet, man-made climate change leading to ultimately man-made biodiversity loss and species extinction. And that, again, has repercussions for what we call global human economic and social development. We are risking to really impair the progress made on social development worldwide. So ecology and social stability, that is why we have that program here at the School of Social Work. Sustainability and ecosystem services are closely linked with human welfare, well-being, and health. And social stability and access to resources such as education, human security, which is defined as freedom from poverty, freedom from hunger, freedom from oppressive rule, and being entitled to live a life in dignity. There are these close linkages and feedback loops, and therefore it is important to look at this from a One Health perspective. This is greenhouse gas emissions by country. The world map we drawn around greenhouse gas emissions. Look at the United States. Number one, this is per capita, okay, to be fair. China, of course, now does more, but not per capita. Look at South America and look at Africa. They almost disappear from the global landscape. If we were to remake the world map according to per capita greenhouse gas emissions. And this is the same thing, but just using severe health impacts of climate change. And then it's just the other way around. Look at Africa, that's the big one. That's where most people suffer directly, physically, from climate change. This is using data from malaria, dengue fever, diarrhea, malnutrition, flooding, and heat waves caused by climate change. And you see how unfair the whole thing is. This is the nations who caused climate change, and this is the nations who suffer from climate change. And this speaks to our agenda in social work. I mean, this is all about a massive disruption of natural, social, ecological stability. So we are not only talking about poor animals, poor planetary resources, we are talking about poor people as well. Africa is hit as usual, unfortunately. It's like, sometimes I don't know how it feels to be there. It's like a curse because yet again, even from climate change, they have the most, they are carrying the most death toll due to climate change on top of everything else. And they don't cause any greenhouse gas emissions except for Johannesburg, Victoria, Durban, and Cape Town. A little bit of Nigeria and Nairobi, and that's basically it. Now, we have learned something from climate change modeling, that we have to stop thinking in terms of separate systems. Okay, here's the world system, the ecological, the physical system, and we are taking care of that. We are activists for the environment. Here's the social sphere. We are social workers and we are activists. We want to empower people and we are advocating for underprivileged, oppressed, marginalized, poor people. But no, it is all one. We live in a social ecological system. We don't live in two separate systems, period. That means whatever we do, and now I come to the solution, the remedy side, we have to approach this as a densely coupled, interacting system, as one system, where there's a lot going on back and forth, there are many feedback loops, and there is nothing you can do here without any impact on the other side. We live in a perfect social ecological system. That means whatever we do for the animals, we also do it for the sake of social development and empowerment of people and vice versa. This concept of social ecological system then has, in the context of health issues, a lot of meaning. So this is vector-borne and zoonotic diseases. Vector is, you know what vector-borne diseases are, 2 minutes. Okay. Zoonotic diseases and vector-borne diseases account for 70% of the emerging and re-emerging infections worldwide, and hence also for all the pandemics we're talking about. Even Ebola is a zoonotic disease. Poaching, bushmeat consumption led to its transmission to humans, like HIV and many other things. There's a lot going on worldwide. These are just a few recent examples. And 70% of those endemics and pandemics are zoonotic. They originate from animals. And their transmission to humans has to do with the proximity or the inadequate management of natural resources or the inadequate approaching of it. Let's put it that way. So it's also man-made. When we are complaining about SARS, about H1N1, swine flu, whatever, it's man-made. It's mostly anthropogenic because we are not getting something right. I have another appointment at the university, Beijing Normal University in China. We did, and Sarah was part of that, we had a project there and we came up with a model, a One Health model. So if you want to look at One Health and really look at the health of humans, all sorts of animals, by the way, animal welfare and animal rights should be part of it. Ecosystem health, planetary systems health, environmental health, all in one. Looking at it as one coherent social ecological system, then this is the model, this is what we need to look at. We should not only look at biophysical factors for disease transmission. This is what CDC does, for instance, okay? They look at this, they say, well, these are the biophysical factors that trigger a zoonotic disease transmission events, and then we need some proximal things here like infrastructure for sanitation, look at the agriculture to mitigate that. That's not the end of the story. We need to look at cultures, values. We need to look at the business cycles. We need to look at global economy and globalization. We need to look at our social networks, the way we further the exploitation in nature through our culture, through our baseball game interruption, Burger King consumption type. This has all to do with the planet's health and with One Health, and ultimately it strikes back on us. I think that's the message of this presentation. And the goal is for a solution to really embark on a broad and integrated, holistic One Health trajectory. In research, in education, and certainly in policy formulation and practice. Practice by the people who do this stuff. And that is also, like a social ecological system, none of those four areas should be seen superior to the other. We have to look at human health, and this is very often the entry point of movement. Animal health, environmental and even planetary health, and then also food safety and security, which is an important factor. These are the four leaves of the clover here. They really belong together. They interact with each other, and they depend on each other. And there are four more areas that we need to look at. One is certainly the impacts of climate change and global environmental change, but also pollution and waste, and how to deal with that to keep it better controlled in the future. Here we have the resource depletion, ecosystem services, and biodiversity side. But then it's also about human and social development, peace and security, sustainability, socioeconomic trajectories and pathways. And then there is a piece of human and animal rights that is very important. When we speak about animals, I like the compassionate conservation approach very much because it does, at least implicitly, what others do when they say it's not only about animal welfare. I mean, animal welfare as such is an important ethical role, but we have to talk about animal rights. And we even have to go beyond compassion, or we have to, let's say, combine compassion with conservation with advocacy for animal rights. Because those animals have, and they are entitled to live a life in freedom and dignity and health, including emotional health, right? So we have to add a piece here, human rights for sure, which is very often lacking. I mean, the death toll in Africa due to climate change, that's also a human rights issue. The same principle ethically should apply to animals, so that we allocate capabilities, entitlements, and rights to animals as well. That has to be part of the One Health agenda. It is not. And then finally, all that would take us to a way to think about social ecological systems and resilience as a model of social ecological justice. Ultimately, it's about justice and fairness. Usually, we are utilitarians, human beings, and say it's just good for everybody by social contract. But we never have animals or plant species or biodiversity as part of those social contracts because they are not social, according to humans. So we have to get rid of this modern paradigm of justice, or at least expand it to include justice for all living species and the planet itself. And I think this would be a true One Health game plan. And if there's hope, then this could be part of it, the hope story. And I would very much love to meet with Mark sometime soon in beautiful Boulder to talk about combining some of the compassionate conservation stuff with social ecological justice theory, maybe right now. I'm so grateful that you have been willing to listen for an hour, a little more than an hour. Thank you very much.